The numbers don't lie. In 2016, the outcome of the presidential election was not only determined by Trump voters, or Clinton voters, or third-party voters. The results of the election were also determined by the people who didn't vote. Now, you might be thinking, what? That doesn't make any sense. But according to the Pew Research Center, the number of eligible voters who stayed home and let other people decide the country's future outnumbered both the Clinton voters and the Trump voters. And the non-voters tended to favor Clinton. Here's how it breaks down. Around 20% of the country voted for Clinton, and around 20% voted for Trump. But almost 30% of the country that was eligible to vote didn't vote. And for those who are crunching the numbers, about 28% of the country was ineligible to vote, and 2% voted for other candidates. What the Pew Research Center shows us about the 2016 election is this. Of the people who leaned Democrat, there was a smaller percentage of those people voting than not voting. Of the people who leaned Republican, there was a bigger percentage of those people voting than not voting. What does that mean? It means there were a lot of unhappy people after the election who preferred Clinton but didn't vote on election day. It means that if more Democrats vote than not vote, they win because there are more of them. It means Republicans had a better turnout from within their party and still lost the popular vote, though they won enough votes in key areas to win the Electoral College. So all of this adds up to one simple thing. If the majority of people who prefer Democrats actually vote, they will win because there are more of them. But here's something you'll hear from time to time. Voting doesn't matter. There's nothing we can do. It's rigged. If that's true, then why are felons denied the right to vote? Why do Republicans spend so much time trying to make it harder for people to vote? If voting doesn't matter, then why do people of color have significantly fewer places to cast their votes in their neighborhoods? And why do billionaires like the Koch brothers spend millions of dollars on political ads? The truth is, voting does matter. We saw it in Alabama, where a Democrat hadn't won a seat in the US Senate in 25 years. But in 2017, Republican Roy Moore lost to Democrat Doug Jones by 20,000 votes. We saw it this year in Pennsylvania, where Democrat Connor Lamb pulled off a major upset over his Republican opponent, winning by merely 700 votes, in a district that had gone to Trump by 20 percentage points in 2016. And we saw it in New York, where a 28-year-old Democratic socialist, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a newcomer to the political area, beat 10-term establishment Democrat Joseph Crowley in the Democratic primary election. 3 weeks before the election, Crowley's polls showed him with a 20% advantage. How did this happen? Polls generally rely on who is expected to vote. That means that they were polling the same people who voted in the past. Meanwhile, Ocasio-Cortez was attracting people who didn't typically vote. She pulled off a major upset, defeating Crowley with 57% of the vote, despite his campaign outspending hers by millions of dollars. So there you have it. Ignore the polls, ignore the odds, ignore the people who say your vote doesn't matter. When it comes to democracy, you either use it or you lose it. Feel free to like and subscribe for more videos from Prompt Media, just like this one every week.
Let's face it, unions have gotten a pretty bad rap lately. But at one point, they played an irreplaceable role in preventing companies from you over instead of paying you fairly. I'm Whitney Van Lanningham, and this is how unions can help you gain fair treatment in the workplace and stick it to the man. Let's start by talking about why unions are important. Everyone who works at a company wants to make enough money to live comfortably, but there's only so much money coming in. And unfortunately, the employees at the bottom of the totem pole don't get to decide where that money goes. The more money is hoarded up top, the less goes to the workers, which leaves them with fewer resources to fight back. Your asshole boss can afford a better lawyer than every single one of you, and the designer shoes to crush you with. But here's the good news. There's way more of you than there are of them. That's what a union is. Unions are basically a collective bargaining tool that work on your behalf to make sure that you're being paid and treated fairly at your job. The more workers there are, the stronger the union. At least, that's the idea. It's also why businesses hate unions, because unions can help with things like this. Between 1945 and 1970, unions more than tripled weekly earnings in manufacturing. They provided protections for fair treatment in the workplace, and union workers were able to do their jobs every day without the existential dread that old age, illness, or unemployment might come along and fuck them over. Honestly, that sounds awesome. Nowadays, most workers are constantly worried about whether or not they'll be able to take paid leave, and are struggling to juggle the just-in-time scheduling and on-call scheduling from their employer. As of 2017, only 10.7% of workers are union members, less than before the National Labor Relations Act passed in 1935, when people didn't even have the right to be in a union. In the private sector, it's even lower at 6.5%. Of course, there's always a downside. Weak unions affect your paycheck as well. Low membership is one of the primary reasons why lower-level employees' wages have plateaued and plummeted recently. But when a union has a healthy membership base, everyone gets bigger paychecks and more defense against abusive practices. So, like, why doesn't everyone just do that? Because it's not that easy. We're living under a wildly outdated law. The NLRA was passed in 1935 and hasn't had a major revision since all 4 Beatles were still alive. For unions to regain strength, they need to be modernized, but under the NLRA, it's actually illegal. The law severely limits how much states can do. For example, in 2008, the Supreme Court cited the NLRA to basically let employers use state funds to pay for anti-union campaigns. I have no idea whether Harry or Lloyd came up with that idea, but it's terrible. Since 2010, 6 GOP-controlled states have passed right-to-work laws, which give workers union representation without mandating they pay union dues, and without union dues, unions can't organize. And if unions can't organize, Republican lawmakers can continue to cut funds from unions first when facing budget gaps, and over pretty much anybody who happens to be living in that state. But that's the crazy thing. Even Republicans agree that unions aren't a bad idea. And Republicans usually hate everything I love, so this is a big deal. Right now, 42% of Republicans support unions, which is up from 26% in 2011. That's a huge jump. America clearly has a very large working class that feels voiceless and powerless, which is how Lord Cheeto got elected in the first place. I'm not afraid to say it, Democrats have failed miserably to protect workers' rights, which totally contributed to Trump's shitty, illegitimate victory. Every time Democrats have held control of Congress or the presidency, they don't pass labor protection laws. It's kind of embarrassing and we need to step it up. Look, you need unions. We all do. It might be one of the few ways we have left to reverse income inequality and a growing oligarchy run by the dumbest rich people America has ever produced. So what can you do to change that? The simplest thing is to join a union and pay dues. But more importantly, look for progressive candidates who actually talk about workers' rights and unionization. And that's the good news. Almost every single profession has a union, from actors to teachers, police officers to musicians, so it's easy to locate your local union and join. And if you can't find a union to join, why not start one? Be the change you want to see in the world, or in this case, your paycheck. For now, thanks for watching Prompt. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, and make sure to tune in every week for more breakdowns just like this one.
When Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2016, he quickly set out to do 2 things: lie about it and make sure it couldn't happen again. He claimed that 3 million undocumented immigrants voted illegally for Hillary Clinton, which is quite a coincidence since he lost by almost exactly 3 million votes. Then he created a voter fraud commission, which tried to create a database of every single voter, all of their personal information, who they had voted for, and which political party they were registered under. Oh, and the last 4 digits of their social security number. I'm Kareem, and this is how Republicans are suppressing your vote. Thankfully, states refused to provide this fake voter fraud commission with any of that information, and Trump gave up on this latest and most alarming form of voter suppression. But I've got some bad news for you. Republicans have spent the last 2 decades making sure young people, people of color, and people with low incomes had the hardest possible time voting, in the hopes that they wouldn't even bother. Take, for example, voter ID laws. Today, more than half of US states require some form of ID to vote. Okay, now you might say, is it really that bad to have to show your ID to vote? Doesn't that cut down on voter fraud? Yes and no. First of all, not everyone has an ID. There's no existing legal requirement for a citizen to have one. And for many people, it's not that easy to get one in the first place. In 2016, 11% of US citizens didn't have a photo ID. In Texas alone, 500,000 US citizens couldn't meet their state's ultra strict ID laws, which can include complicated legal and bureaucratic evidence like birth certificates and name change documents, and ultimately it can get prohibitively expensive. It can take time, money, and travel to get an ID if you don't have one, or if the one you have isn't up to date. Those most likely to be unable to produce an ID are elderly citizens, African Americans, Hispanics, people with disabilities, students, and low-income citizens. Notice that nearly all of those groups reliably vote Democrat. The Washington Post found that between states with and without voter ID laws, the turnout gap between conservative and liberal voters nearly tripled from 7.7 to a whopping 20.4 percentage points. But okay, Republicans are quick to say, How do we know that gap isn't just filled with fraudulent voters? Well, simply enough, because voter fraud doesn't really happen. Every single public interest group that has studied voter fraud or fraudulent voting finds that it happens at rates between 0.0003% and 0.0025%. To be clear, it's more likely for any given American to be struck by lightning while winning the lottery than it is for them to be impersonated at the polls. It just doesn't happen at any meaningful rate, much less the 3 million votes Trump is claiming and the restrictive voter ID laws that prevent people of color from casting their vote. But voter ID laws are just the tip of the iceberg. See, the same people who can't afford to take time off from work or the expense or the travel necessary to get an ID also have trouble voting. So when they show up to a long line at the polls, they're most likely to just leave. And Republicans know that. So in 2016, across the entire country, they closed down polling stations in predominantly Hispanic, Black, and low-income regions, leaving only a few open and crazy long lines. In 2016, a survey by the Leadership Council of Civil Rights showed that 45% had reduced the number of available polling stations. There's now 868 fewer. The result? To vote in the 2016 primary in Phoenix, for example, voters waited in a 4 to 5 hour long line containing 700 people. The most closings in the country was in Arizona's Pima County, which closed 68 polling stations between 2012 and 2016. Pima is 35% Hispanic and leans Democratic. Cochise County, 30% Latino and also in Arizona, closed 63% of its polling locations, the biggest percentage in the country. It's 130,000 residents could now vote at only 18 locations. The North Carolinian city of Shelby, which is 40% Black, had its 5 polling stations consolidated into 2. Early voting would be immensely helpful to increase turnout, but North Carolina Republicans cut early voting too and bragged about this move giving them results. Many GOP-controlled counties in North Carolina limited early hours and locations too and saw higher Republican turnout. In short, there's specific ways in which Republican legislators use the myth of voter fraud to create very real voter suppression and brag about it. But luckily, there are actual concrete ways to help people who are disenfranchised by the state. But it takes more than online activism. You can help register people to vote by joining or starting a voter registration drive. You can help transport people to the polls on election day. You can make sure to vote early or vote by mail so that those who need more time or have to vote later in the day aren't waiting because of you. And if you're at the polls and you see long lines, voter intimidation, or suppression, report those issues by calling 1-866-OUR-VOTE. And as always, if you've got a bit of spare cash and want to help out on the legal side, donate to the ACLU. We'll drop links in the description to help you navigate all of those options. Thanks for watching Prompt. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more episodes just like this every single week.